Let's bring in Martin Feldstein, one of the world's top economists and a professor at Harvard. He also served as White House chief economist in the Reagan administration, and he joins me now from our bureau in D.C. Dr. Feldstein, welcome back to Bloomberg Television. Always good to have you on.
Nice to be back with you.
Sir, what are you making of this back and forth between Democrats and Republicans on the Hill? Are we faced with an imminent shutdown of the U.S. government?
Well, I think there's a reasonable chance that that's going to happen. I think that at this point nobody can really know, because it's really about whether they can find a basis for agreement about tough dollar issues.
Do you see any common ground at this point?
Well, the Republicans started by asking for cuts in a $600 billion annual spend, cuts of less than 10%. They've cut that number more or less in half, but they're still having a hard time getting an agreement from the Democrats.
Well, earlier today, David Malpass of Encima Global Capital was on with our Tom Keene on Surveillance Midday, and he did point out that the debt-to-GDP ratio is still too high. But given that as a backdrop, at this point, how do you slash spending without jeopardizing growth?
Well, the numbers they're talking about, whether it's 30 billion or 40 billion, is tiny in comparison to the size of the economy and the size of, for example, the impact of rising oil prices. A $10 rise in the cost of a barrel of oil amounts to some $40 billion of funds being transferred from American consumers to the oil-producing countries, 40 billion. And what we're seeing a quarrel about in the Congress is sort of plus or minus $10 billion. So it's really a question of whether the American public, the business community, small businesses can have confidence that Congress is going to be able to deal in the long term with the size of the fiscal deficit.
And of course, as I mentioned, you were chief economist in the Reagan administration. And back during that time, was there as much controversy as there is now about these so-called policy riders that seem to be at the crux of these negotiations right now?
No, there wasn't. But I must say, I think the policy riders are in a sense being played up by the Democrats because they don't want to talk about the fundamental issue, which is the size of the budget.
Interestingly enough, though, the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said that he believes that these negotiations are being held hostage by one such rider, and that would be to defund Planned Parenthood. I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think this is what the Democrats are trying to say to deflect attention from the fundamental question of whether we can control spending, whether we can slow the growth of government spending so that we actually stop this explosion, and that's what we're witnessing, an explosion of the national debt under the Obama administration.
Dr. Feldstein, if the Bush tax cuts had been rescinded, are we even having this conversation or these negotiations right now? Would that have solved the problem?
It would have pushed us into a very serious economic downturn.
How so?
There's no question. Well, because if we had had the increase in taxes that was being talked about, fortunately didn't happen, but the increase in taxes that was being talked about when people said, well, let's just discontinue the Bush tax cuts, that would have been a much bigger hit to incomes than the plus or minus 10 or $20 billion that's being discussed now in these budget negotiations. So I'm very glad that the president finally acceded to what the Republicans wanted in terms of carrying forward the Bush tax cuts for at least another 2 years so we could work on the spending side of the budget.
Dr. Martin Feldstein, former White House chief economist during the Reagan administration, joining us from Washington. Dr. Feldstein, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much.